Alright, welcome back to the channel. So if you've been following along with this series of videos, let me pull this up. So we've been covering just some like input and output functionality, so like reading and writing data from CSV, text, JSON, and JavaScript files. So in this video, in the previous video, we went through an example of how we could write structure set information to a JavaScript file. And so in this video, I just want to show an example of what you might use a JavaScript file for. So JavaScript files are useful because they can contain more information than just the data. So you can put the data into a variable, but you could also use other JavaScript files to manipulate the data and or process do whatever, right? Read the data, use the data, and then you could use that in that JavaScript code. You could actually add to an HTML document, and the HTML document could load the data, and it could load your other JavaScript files that process the data and that build your HTML page. So that way you could actually build something that would actually view the data. So what we did is in our program, when we hit debug or start, what it does is it pulls up this, it does a few things. So the first thing it does is it collects some beam data it loads beam data from a CSV, and it does that in 3 milliseconds, and then it loads some sample patient data. Again, this is all like dummy data, just so we can do it outside of Eclipse. But then it also loads the patient data from JSON, but then it also loads some beam data from JSON, and you can see it's actually more efficient to do so from JSON. So then we tell it how many loops that we want, and so let's just do it once, and it loops through the structure set. So it creates, in the program, it creates a dummy structure set that contains some prostate structures, so like the rectum, bladder, femoral heads, things like that, CTV, PTV. And so it's going to loop through that structure set one time, however many times we tell it, and it's going to write, it's going to add the data to the JavaScript string, the data string, X number of times. So in this case, we selected 1, so it's going to loop through and add that information one time to the JavaScript variables object. And so I can open let me stop and actually then just to recap, so it does it 2 different ways. So it will do it using string addition, using like plus equals, but then it'll also it'll do the same thing the same number of times using string builder. And you can see that it took 0.001 less seconds to, or 0.0007 seconds less to do it using a string builder. And just really quickly, so you can kind of see the point of what this project was so that we could test how long they take. So if we do, let's just do 1,000 real quick, just so you can see. If you haven't watched the previous video, you can see that it takes almost 5 seconds to do it using using string addition, so plus equals, and then it takes only a fraction of a second to do it using a string builder. And I actually have a screenshot, I believe. Let me find it. Here, I'll pause and find it. All right, so here's a screenshot of where we did it in, we looped through 5,000 times, and we can see that it took, in this example, or this time that we tested it took 160 seconds. The amount of time that it actually took in the previous video was actually like, I think just under 180 seconds, so it took almost 3 minutes. Whereas it only took 2.2 in this test run, it took 2.3 seconds to use a string builder. So, and just to recap, the reason for that is because strings are immutable, whereas which means that they can't be edited. So every time you air quotes edit your string or add to it, you actually have to recreate a new string and then add the previous state of the string to the new whatever you want to add to it. And so you wind up eating up a lot of memory depending on how many times you're doing it. So in this case, imagine if you're doing it 1,000,000 times, right? It would just get progressively longer each time. Whereas with a string builder, string builders are mutable, which means that they can be edited and we can just append to it. So we're just calling an append method every single time we loop through, and it's just a lot faster than having to actually instantiate another string that's the length of the previous one plus like whatever you want to add to it. So anyway, so that's just an example there. So what we have done just now, let's actually rerun this, doing it just one time so we can see what that file looks like, because we just don't want to work with a big file. So we'll do it one time. We can see it takes hardly any time at all. We'll stop that and let's actually open up the output file. So actually, I think we still actually have those open from before. So using Visual Studio Code, let me format this. And we can see that we have a structure data, which is an array of all of the structures. And since we loop through one time, we can see that each structure is only represented one time. Whereas if we loop through twice, each structure would be repeated twice or found twice, etc. So that's just a way to make a progressively longer string, quickly, like as in a test. So it's not something that you would actually want to do in real life, but just for the sake of this example. So with one iteration, we capture the structure set data one time, and it's just some dummy data. And then we capture this elapsed object, which contains two properties of seconds and milliseconds, and then we have another property called number of loops. So again, this string addition data variable contains three objects. One is the structure data, one is the elapsed data, and then one is the number of loops. All right, and then we actually do the same thing, but with the string builder data. We write the same exact file, but the only difference being that so the number of loops is the same, the data contained in the structure data is the same. The only difference being the elapsed property, which is the seconds and milliseconds that it took to do it using string builder, as opposed to here it's the time that it took to use string addition. So it took 0.004 seconds versus 0.001 seconds. So we can format this if we want. You don't have to, like a minified file would be like not formatted, but in this case we'll just go ahead and format it so it's easier to read. Alright, so this is the variable that's created from our script, right? So imagine that you have written a script using ESAPI where you've collected some data in some format like this, right? Well, it's in a JavaScript file. The nice thing about JavaScript files is that they can be loaded in a HTML document. So if I open up this sample, let's see, I don't think I can, let's just open it here. But let's also open it using Visual Studio Code, because it lends really well to like web projects. So let's open this with code. All right, so I can't. It's weird. I can't zoom in. I think actually, hold down. I think it's like Control and then the plus sign. So, all right, so there we go. All right, so this, we have some, in our HTML document, this is just like a very, 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 very basic HTML doc. And so we have a header, which contains the title, and then we have our body. So then we have two divs. We have one div that's going to contain the information from the string addition section, or string addition file. And then we have another div that's going to contain data from the string builder test. So this is, let's actually rename this as string addition test. And this one will be string builder, or string, let's actually call this string concatenation test. And up here, let's add plus equals. Okay, and we're going to show, we have inside each div we have a paragraph tag, And then we also have another div. So the paragraph tag is going to hold the elapsed, the time that it took to elapse the information. That's our goal. And you can see it's not here. So you may wonder, like, and if we were going to add it here, we would actually have to hard code it. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to use another JavaScript, a JavaScript file to add the data from these files. So it's going to use these variables, and then it's going to access them, and then add the data using a for each loop to each of these respective divs. So let me open that now. Oh, and then after we've created our body, then we're going to load the data, and then we're going to load the script. So before we can load the script file, which is the structures.js file, let me open this. Before we load the script file, we want to load the data, and we want to load. In this example, we're going to load the body prior to loading the data, because if we did this with the 5,000, or even 1,000 iterations, or even 100 iterations, honestly, it would actually, nothing would actually show up until the data was loaded, right? So we actually want to load that first. Okay, so we're gonna load our body, then our data, and then we're going to load this script file, which the script file is what's actually going to process the data. So remember, in this we defined two variables. In this file we defined a string builder data variable, and then in this one we have a string addition data variable. And so let's see, you can see that here we're using the string addition data variable, and then here we're using the string builder data variable, right? And we're just looping through each of the structured data. So we're accessing the structured data property, and then we're looping through using a for each. So if we go back, we see that this variable has a structured data property, and it's an array, so we can loop through the array with a for each statement. And we're defining an anonymous variable. So like in C# we would do like for each var s from or s and structures. We would loop through, and we would access each of the structures properties using whatever variable name that we give it, right? Well, in JavaScript we just have to tell it what parameters that it's going to take, and so we're defining that parameter as or that object. So we're looping through the structured data, we're defining each of those objects as S, and then we can access those properties here. So all we're doing is we're using JavaScript to get each of these elements from the HTML page. So there's an element here that is this paragraph tag has an ID of string test time elapsed. So then in our JavaScript file we're getting that element using JavaScript, and we're going to say get document.get element by ID, and then we pass it that ID. We do the same thing for the string test div, and then we do the same thing for the string builder, the time elapsed paragraph tag, and the string builder test div, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to, when we loop through all of the string builder data, we're going to, for each of those structures, we're going to add to the string builder's div, we're going to add to its inner HTML. And we're just going to add an unordered list that contains some data. So there's going to be an unordered list that's going to contain a list item that contains the structure's ID, but also has a background of the structure's color. And then we're going to contain another list item that's going to say volume, and then it's going to have its volume, and then its max dose. And then we're going to do the same thing for the structure data. The string addition data variables structure data property. We're going to do the same thing. And then for each of those divs, we're also going to add in to the paragraph tag where it's the time elapsed. We're going to add in a string that just says, or like a value that says time elapsed for this number of loops took this much time or this many seconds, right? We're going to say it in seconds, and then we're also going to say it in milliseconds. Okay, so just so you can see what this looks like, let's just open it. Let's see. All right, so over here, let's make it bigger. But that actually will show you that it's two different separate divs, right? So when it's larger, then it's large enough to show all of this in a single line, so you can see that they line up really well. But this is just what we wrote, right? But they're separate divs. Here you can see that these colors, these rows don't line up anymore because it takes more space to add this, right? And that's just with simple CSS. It's beyond the scope of this video, but this is just an example of how you can load data, right, into you can view and manipulate data using JavaScript. So you can write your data from Eclipse to a JavaScript file, and then you can write other JavaScript files and HTML code to both view and process said data. So you can do that. So let's just run it one more time. Let's see, let's shrink this down. Let's go back to not this, but this. And let's just run it one more time. And let's just run it like, I don't know, 50 times, right? It's not going to take long. But now we have the structure sets. If we open back up Visual Studio Code, we can see that this is a much longer file, right? It's not just loop through one. It doesn't represent the structure set one time. It represents it 50 times. So now if we go back to our web page, you can see that it's still only, it only shows it one time, but all we have to do is refresh. And once it's done refreshing, we can see that it contains much more data, right? And so that's just an example to show that it's got new data. And what happens is when the structure set gets created, every time the programs run, it just gets a color based on some random values. So that's why the colors are different. So if we run it again, the colors will be different again, or whatever. So there you go. There's an example. And the reason that it takes so long, even with just 50 times, so like if you have a lot of data, right, then it's, here we can see that it's showing the, at least part of the body. But, it took, I don't know, 5-10 seconds for it to load all of this data. Well, imagine that you had, a bunch of different plans that you were trying to represent data for. That's where you might benefit from actually using a web server and then using like some lazy load capabilities where like how on Facebook or something like that you have like an endless scroll, right? I believe that's what they referred to it as. But it only loads data as you need it. So whereas here we're loading all the data up front, right? And then we're visualizing all of the data at once. Whereas, maybe you wanted to get really in depth and you wanted to create a database. So instead of saving all of your data to files, maybe you create a database, you save that information to the database, and then you create a web browser or like a web project that uses a web server and connects to said database, and then you create like GET and PUT requests and things like that to your database to visualize and edit and that sort of thing. So then you would create some sort of project for your users to, visualize whatever data that you're processing or collecting or whatever. This is just an example of how you could do something on a much smaller scale using just JavaScript files and static HTML files. Because again, there's not a web server running. We're literally just opening a web page, a document. See, like you can see, like it, we have a path here. But anyway, so I digress. So that will be it, I believe, for this example video. So in the next video, we'll spend probably not very much time, but we'll go over some examples of like using text files. It's super straightforward. It probably won't be, hopefully won't be a very long video, but if you are interested in logging, or whatever, you can see what an example solution might look like, and how you can do that with text files. So with that, thanks for joining, and hope you have a great day.